Members of the Commission. My name is Sela Shai. I've been a lawyer for about 15 years, and I've studied and published on state subjects law. Since the 1930s, before the creation of India and Pakistan as we know it, Kashmiris have been fighting for representative government and the right to decide their own future. Inevitably, these aspirations are crushed by violent state repression until one generation ages and relents and another one comes of age. In the 3 generations before me, several of my relatives have either been jailed, tortured, or killed for speaking the same truths that I am here to say to you today. So speaking openly to you about the plight of Kashmir without fearing for my life is a privilege that I do not take for granted. When Article 370 was unilaterally abrogated by the BJP-led government, I was dismayed but not surprised. The revocation of Kashmir's so-called special status has long been a target of the BJP as far back as 1953, when it was the subject of a major campaign by the BJP's predecessor party. This unilateral and unconstitutional action impacts all 12 million indigenous residents of the state, of all religions and all ethnicities, and representatives of all significant subpopulations within the state have expressed concern about this abrogation. Article 370 was intended to limit the powers of the Indian state over Jammu and Kashmir, and Article 35A enshrined a long-standing law in Kashmir that predated independent India and Pakistan, which defined state subjects, which are now called permanent residents. State subjects were to be given preferential treatment in government employment, and land ownership was to be restricted to state subjects only. India's repeated failure to abide by the constitutional provision of Article 370 from the outset has resulted in a de facto annexation of Kashmir. India achieved this by engaging in a pattern of jailing political activists until they conceded to the demands of the center, preventing free assembly of civilians, punishing journalists who published truthfully, and packing the territory with military personnel to terrorize the local population, all of which they justified by invoking the specter of national security. With the current siege and the abrogation of Article 370, India's long-standing project to unlawfully annex Kashmir is complete, and the consequences have already proven disastrous. The Indian government's position was captured neatly in an op-ed written by Ambassador Shringla in the New York Times. It's rife with factual errors, mischaracterizations of the law, and predictable complaints about Pakistan. There are mainly 3 arguments: development, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights, and I'll address all 3. First, Article 370 has not been an impediment to development in Kashmir, and notwithstanding the heavy military occupation and the dire situation over the last many decades, the human development indicators in Kashmir are still higher than the national average, and in some cases, among the best in the nation, despite disproportionately low levels of public investment from India. These remarkable development indicators can be attributed directly to sweeping land reforms that occurred in the 1950s to dismantle the feudal system, which was only made possible by a separate constitution. To be clear, the BJP goal is not development, but demographic change and exploitation of abundant natural resources. Having failed to quell a near-century-old fight for representative government, demographic change is now the strategy. By resettling Kashmir with non-Kashmiris, it can advance its project to enshrine the Hindu identity of the nation. And analysts in the press have remarked that this mirrors Beijing's strategy of encouraging Han Chinese to move to Xinjiang, a northwestern province with Muslim ethnic groups. In fact, within days of announcing the abrogation, the federal government announced that it had prepared a development plan that would facilitate private investment, and industry would now be possible due to their new ability to buy land. This is a completely false premise, as corporations are expressly permitted to become permanent residents in Kashmir, which has been documented through an order that was published in 1927, and foreign corporations often hold land in 99-year leases. And of course, the government of India has faced no barriers in expropriating an enormous amount of land, roughly the size of my hometown in Dallas, Texas, for its own security camps and armed forces. This is land that would otherwise be used for housing, recreation, or agriculture. I welcome questions. I can delve into this in a little more detail, but I know my time is short. The next argument is that the abrogation of Article 370 is required to protect women from gender discriminatory laws. This is exactly what I published on, and the law is very clear. It's well settled. Since 2002, a high court case made it clear that Kashmiri state subject women do not lose their property rights if they marry a non-Kashmiri. And in fact, non-Kashmiri women obtain state subject status when they marry a Kashmiri man. There's also, with respect to family law, it's been argued that the issue of instant divorce could only be cured with the abrogation of Article 370. The issue of instant divorce was already remedied in detail in 2012 in a high court case when the court ruled that a husband does not have an unqualified power to pronounce divorce. Regardless, there's absolutely no evidence that instant divorce even occurs with any frequency in Kashmir. But additionally, and most importantly, revoking Article 370 to address gender discrimination in the state stands in direct contrast to the will of Kashmiri women, who alongside men have repeatedly been protesting in favor of the rights of Kashmiris to have self-determination and an end to the Indian Army's abuses in Kashmir. Finally, Article 370's revocation does absolutely nothing legally to benefit the LGBTQ community. As in the rest of India, homosexuality was decriminalized in Kashmir after Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was held to be unconstitutional. As with all Kashmiris, the LGBT community there also wants an end to the military occupation. And as countless legal scholars have explained, the court's decision extends to all state high courts, including the High Court of Jammu and Kashmir. And there's no special law in the Jammu and Kashmir constitution that otherwise criminalizes homosexuality. India's approach to Kashmir can be summed up by an adaptation of Carl Sandburg's famous quip: if the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. If the law and the facts are against you, just pound the table and yell about Pakistan. But as Gandhi said, truth never damages a cause that is just. And that is why I support the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights recommendations on the human rights crisis in Kashmir, because they are concrete and actionable steps to get to the bottom, to get to the truth of what has happened in Kashmir, both for the majority population and the minority. And I urge our congressmen and our congresswomen to support a resolution that calls for an end to the siege and that provides diplomatic support for a pathway that allows the people of Jammu and Kashmir to decide their own future. Thank you.